On a cold November night in 1910, a private train sat quietly at a dimly lit station in New Jersey, steam rising, lamps flickering, and not a single journalist in sight. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but if you looked a little closer, you'd notice something strange. 6 of the most powerful men in America, men who collectively controlled more wealth than most nations, were slipping into a sealed rail car under fake names. They didn't greet each other with handshakes or titles. No one said, "Mr. Morgan," or "Senator Aldrich," or "Warburg." Instead, they used simple first names, Bill, Harry, Frank, as if hiding their identities was more important than the business that brought them there. And to make the trip look innocent, each carried a hunting rifle, claiming they were going on a duck shooting trip. But there were no dogs, no decoys, no gear, only briefcases filled with documents. Their destination? A remote, privately owned island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. A place so isolated that even the locals whispered about it. A place where America's wealthiest families once vacationed behind guarded gates. And now for 9 days, this island would become the birthplace of a plan that would change the United States forever. Well, this is that meeting, the real one, the one most history books only mention in passing, if they mention it at all. And the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Because when 6 of the richest men in America disappear onto a midnight train under fake names, carrying hunting rifles they never intended to use, you can't help but wonder, why would men who effectively held the U.S. economy in their hands need to sneak away like fugitives? What could be so sensitive, so dangerous, that they couldn't even risk being seen on the same train? And most importantly, what were they trying to keep hidden from the American public? As the train pulled away from the station, its wheels cutting through the fog like a blade, this midnight journey set the stage for one of the most consequential shifts in financial power in modern history. A shift that would eventually decide who controls America's money, how banks create dollars out of thin air, and why your purchasing power has quietly eroded for more than a century. This isn't just a history lesson. This is the story of how a small group of men wrote the blueprint for the Federal Reserve, a system that touches your mortgage, your savings, your retirement, and every dollar in your pocket. And understanding how it began is the key to understanding what's happening in America today. So tonight, we're boarding that train together, back to a moment when the future of American money was drafted behind closed doors, on an island no one was supposed to talk about. As that midnight train disappeared into the fog, America itself was heading toward a crisis it could no longer outrun. To understand why those 6 men were willing to hide their identities and travel like conspirators, you have to step back and look at the country they were trying, some would say trying and failing, to steer. In the early 1900s, the United States was booming on the surface, but underneath, the financial system was held together with little more than hope and habit. Banks operated like independent kingdoms, each one making its own rules, each one vulnerable to the smallest shock. And the average American? They trusted banks about as much as they trusted monarchy. In fact, the very idea of a central bank felt un-American. To many, it was a symbol of European aristocracy, kings, crowns, and shadowy clerks in London or Berlin deciding the fate of ordinary workers. Americans wanted no part of that. But then came 1907. If you talk to people who lived through it, they tell you it didn't feel like a financial panic. It felt like the floor collapsing. Stocks crashed. Business owners went under overnight. Banks closed their doors with no warning, and lines formed around street corners, people desperate to pull out whatever savings they had left. For families who had spent their entire lives scraping together a few dollars, the fear was paralyzing. And once fear takes over a banking system, it spreads faster than any virus. What makes 1907 so extraordinary isn't just the chaos, it's what stopped it. Because when the system began to fall apart, there was no Federal Reserve, no central authority, no emergency plan, no mechanism to stabilize anything. Instead, the country turned to one man, not a president, not a senator, but a banker, J.P. Morgan. Morgan was so powerful that in many ways, he acted as the unofficial central bank of the United States. And in the middle of the panic, he did something almost unbelievable by today's standards. He locked several of the nation's top bankers inside his personal library, literally locked the doors, and refused to let them leave until they agreed to pool their money and keep the financial system from collapsing. And the wildest part? It worked. But the victory came with a bitter aftertaste, because once the panic was over, a harsh truth became impossible to ignore. A modern nation of millions should never have to depend on the personal judgment or the personal wealth of a single man. What if Morgan hadn't stepped in? What if he had hesitated? What if he simply didn't care? That's when the calls for a solution grew louder. Not from everyday Americans. They still distrusted anything that smelled like central control, but from the financial elite who had lived through the panic up close. The bankers, the industrialists, the policymakers, the very same men who would soon board that secret train to Jekyll Island. To them, the equation was simple. If the next panic came, and history suggested it would, they needed a system that could act quickly, decisively, and without relying on the goodwill of any one individual. But the question that still lingered was this: were they trying to protect the country or protect themselves? That tension between national stability and private interest is the thread that guides us into the next chapter. And to see what happened behind those closed doors on Jekyll Island, you first have to understand the plan they carried with them. And that's where we're headed next. When those men stepped onto Jekyll Island, they weren't just escaping the public eye. They were carrying with them the memory of 1907, a national humiliation that proved the country had no real financial backbone. And for 9 days, behind locked doors and guarded hallways, they worked to design something they believed would prevent another disaster. Whether it would protect the American people or protect themselves, that depended on who you asked. Inside that private clubhouse, one voice stood out more than the rest: Paul Warburg. Quiet, reserved, but unmistakably brilliant. Unlike the others, Warburg wasn't shaped by American banking. He was shaped by Europe, by London, Berlin, and the well-oiled machinery of the European central banks. To the men in that room, he was the closest thing to a financial architect, and he knew exactly what a modern system needed. Warburg believed America was like a giant ship without a rudder. Too many banks, too little coordination, and no one to steer when the waves turned violent. His goal was simple: give the country something that acted like a central bank, but don't call it a central bank. Americans hated that term. So the new institution had to look like a government agency, safe, official, neutral, while remaining firmly under the influence of private bankers who understood money better than any politician ever could. And that's where the plan began to take shape. The idea was to create an entity that could step in during a crisis, inject liquidity into the system, and prevent banks from collapsing like they did in 1907. Warburg introduced a concept that would become the beating heart of the new system: the lender of last resort. It meant that when banks made risky bets, and those bets went south, this new institution could pour money into the system to stabilize everything. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's still how the modern Federal Reserve works today. To make this idea clearer, imagine a casino deciding to create a special fund, not for the gamblers, but for the casino itself. A fund that guarantees the house will never go bankrupt, no matter how many players win in a single night. That's essentially what the lender of last resort function was designed to do. It wasn't about protecting the public. It was about making sure the financial system and the people who ran it could survive their own mistakes. But even with all these plans on the table, there was still one huge problem. Americans didn't want anything that smelled like centralized power. They feared it, they distrusted it, And if the public knew that Wall Street elites, men with unimaginable wealth, were designing the nation's financial future in secret, the plan would be dead on arrival. So the blueprint needed finesse. It needed political camouflage. It needed to be presented not as a tool of bankers, but as a safeguard for everyday Americans. A system that looked like it belonged to the country, while quietly being guided by the same men who had gathered on that island. By the end of those 9 days, the group walked away with a document that would later be known as the Aldrich Plan, named after Senator Nelson Aldrich, the political heavyweight in the room. It was elegant, clever, and strategically crafted to survive public scrutiny. And even though the plan wouldn't pass in its original form, it would become the DNA of the Federal Reserve Act just a few years later. Now the question becomes, how do you take a blueprint written by bankers on a remote island and convince a skeptical nation to accept it as law? That's the political chess match waiting for us in the next part of the story. When the men from Jekyll Island returned to Washington, they believed they had crafted something airtight, a plan that would stabilize the nation's financial system and give the United States the kind of monetary structure Europe already relied on. But they underestimated one force far bigger than any banker in New York: public suspicion. Once word began to spread that Senator Nelson Aldrich, a man closely tied to Wall Street, had championed a banking reform bill written largely by private financiers, Americans pushed back hard. Newspapers accused the proposal of handing the nation's money supply to a banking cartel. Farmers, small-town merchants, and working families saw it as an elite power grab. In the public's eyes, it wasn't reform, it was a takeover. The Aldrich Plan was dead on arrival, but this is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Because instead of abandoning the plan, its architects simply changed the strategy. They didn't rewrite the heart of the proposal, they rewrote the packaging. If the American public wouldn't accept a banking system designed by Republicans and Wall Street bankers, then the solution was simple: hand the proposal to the opposing party, give it a brand new name, and present it as a bill designed to protect the people from those very bankers. It was a political masterstroke. The plan became the Federal Reserve Act, a name that sounded neutral, official, almost patriotic. Gone was the scent of private influence. Gone was the connection to the Aldrich Plan. And standing at the podium to support it was not Aldrich, but President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat who positioned the new bill as a safeguard against the very interests that had originally designed it. To the public, it looked like the opposite of Wall Street control. But behind the scenes, almost every structural pillar of the Aldrich Plan remained intact. The regional reserve banks, the discount window, the lender of last resort function, the elastic money supply, these were the ideas born on Jekyll Island, only now wrapped inside a political Trojan horse. And then came the timing. On December 23, 1913, while most lawmakers had already boarded trains home for the Christmas holidays, the bill was pushed through Congress. Many representatives were absent, debate was minimal, and at a moment when the country was distracted by family gatherings and holiday celebrations, the Federal Reserve Act slid quietly into law. It was one of the most consequential and one of the most strategically timed votes in American financial history. In the years that followed, President Wilson would later express regret, a sentiment that still fuels debate today. One quote often attributed to him reads, "I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit." Historians still argue about whether Wilson said these exact words, but the sentiment reflects a very real unease that emerged after the Federal Reserve's creation. The fear that a system meant to protect the nation might also concentrate power in ways the public never fully understood. For some Americans, the Federal Reserve was a lifeline, a stabilizer in a world that had already tasted financial chaos. For others, it was evidence that the country had handed over the keys to its economic engine without truly knowing who would be driving. But whichever side you stand on, one thing is undeniable. Beneath the political speeches, beneath the rebranding, beneath the promise of national protection, the DNA of the Jekyll Island blueprint survived intact. And the first test of that new system, the test that would reveal its true strength and its true flaws, came sooner than anyone expected. And that's where we're headed next. Once the Federal Reserve Act became law, America had a new institution with enormous power, power that most citizens didn't fully understand. And maybe that was the point, because if you asked the average American in 1913 how money was created, they would have said it came from gold, hard work, or the government mint. But the truth was about to become far stranger than anything they imagined. To understand how the Federal Reserve works, you have to start with a simple but unsettling fact. Modern money isn't backed by gold, it's backed by debt. That's what we call fiat currency, a system where dollars have value because the government says they do, and because people believe they do. But once the link to gold was broken, something fundamental changed. A dollar was no longer a claim on a fixed amount of metal. It became a promise, one that could be expanded almost without limit. Here's where things get even more surprising. When you deposit $100 into your bank, most people assume the bank keeps that money in a vault, waiting for the day you need it back. But under a system called fractional reserve banking, that isn't what happens at all. Your $100 becomes the seed for something much larger. The bank might keep $10 in reserve and loan out 90. And when that 90 is deposited somewhere else, it can be loaned out again, over and over. One deposit becomes multiple loans, and those loans become new money. It's as if the financial system discovered how to breathe in more dollars than it ever breathed out. Money, once tied to the physical limits of gold, now expanded through the mathematics of lending. For a growing country, it was a powerful tool, but it also meant that money was no longer something solid. It was something elastic, stretching as far as the system allowed, tightening only when the Fed stepped in to slow it down. That's where the Federal Reserve's mandate comes in. Officially, the Fed exists to keep prices stable and maintain maximum employment. In theory, that means smoothing out the booms and busts, making sure inflation doesn't spiral, and guiding the economy towards steady growth. But in practice, its decisions ripple into every corner of American life. Your mortgage rate, your savings account, your retirement, even the price of groceries. And here's the part that lands hardest for anyone who's watched the value of a dollar change across their lifetime. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve, the value of the US dollar has fallen by roughly 96%. A dollar today buys only a tiny fraction of what it once did. Your parents' grocery bill, your grandparents' rent, even the cost of a college education, none of these numbers resemble what they were decades ago. The decline is slow, almost invisible year by year, but impossible to ignore across a lifetime. Inflation isn't a glitch in the system. It's built into the design. Because when money is created through debt, and debt expands through lending, the system naturally grows, and the value of each dollar naturally shrinks. For people with assets like stocks or real estate, the rising tide can feel like a blessing. But for people holding cash, living on fixed incomes, or trying to save for the future, it feels like the ground beneath them is quietly giving way. And that brings us to the question at the heart of the next chapter. If the Federal Reserve was created to protect the country from crisis, why did it fail its very first major test? To answer that, we need to look at what happened less than 20 years after the Fed was born. The greatest financial collapse in modern history. A moment that would reveal exactly how powerful and how fragile the system had become. That story begins in 1929. When the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, it was sold to the public as a guardian, an institution designed to prevent the kind of chaos that ripped through the country in 1907. It was meant to be the steady hand on the wheel, the mechanism that would smooth out the violent booms and busts of the American economy. But less than 2 decades later, that promise was put to the ultimate test, and the results were devastating. By 1929, the American economy looked unstoppable. Wall Street was booming, credit was everywhere, and ordinary families who had never touched the stock market were suddenly taking loans to buy shares. But beneath the excitement, the cracks were forming. Too much speculation, too much leverage, and too many banks built on fragile foundations. When the crash finally came in October of 1929, it wasn't just stocks that collapsed. It was confidence. And confidence in a debt-based system is everything. This was the moment the Federal Reserve was created for. The moment it was supposed to step in, provide liquidity, calm the panic, and stabilize the markets. Instead, it did the opposite. As banks began to fail, the Fed tightened the money supply. Loans dried up, credit froze. Businesses that were already struggling could no longer afford inventory or payroll. Farmers watched their prices collapse. Families lost their savings. And the banks that were supposed to be protected by the Fed's lender of last resort function were left to fend for themselves. Thousands of banks failed. Entire communities were wiped out. And the institution designed to prevent disaster ended up amplifying it. Milton Friedman, one of America's most respected economists, later called this failure one of the greatest economic policy mistakes in U.S. history. The Fed didn't just miss the warning signs. It stepped on the brakes at the exact moment the country needed it to accelerate. Instead of acting like a stabilizer, it became gasoline on a fire no one could contain. And this is where it hits home for anyone who's lived through more than one economic cycle. The patterns didn't end in 1929. If you fast forward nearly 80 years to the financial crisis of 2008, the script looks painfully familiar. Only this time, everything reversed. In 1929, the Fed tightened too much. In 2008, it loosened so aggressively that the entire financial system was flooded with money. The contrast is impossible to ignore. In 1929, ordinary Americans lost their farms, their savings, and their livelihoods, while the banks collapsed around them. In 2008, when the banks were the ones who had taken reckless risks, the Fed bailed them out, declaring them too big to fail, while millions of Americans lost their homes. Same institution, different crisis, same message. The people at the bottom pay the highest price. The Great Depression exposed something fundamental about the new system. The Federal Reserve had enormous power, but that power wasn't neutral. It could stabilize an economy, or it could contract it. It could rescue institutions, or it could let them fall. And once the public began to understand that the system didn't always act in their interest, a question started to echo through American society. If the Fed wasn't created to protect ordinary people, then who was it created to protect? That question leads directly into the final chapter of this story, because the biggest cost of the Federal Reserve System isn't measured in bank failures or stock charts. It's measured in something far more personal, something every American feels whether they realize it or not. And that cost is what we explore next. When you trace the story of American money, from that secret train ride in 1910 to the birth of the Federal Reserve to the crises that followed, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest force shaping the life of every American isn't always written in headlines. It isn't debated on cable news. It doesn't show up in election speeches. It moves quietly, silently, like a tide rising inch by inch. That force is inflation. And inflation isn't an accident. It's built into the structure of our financial system. Every time new money enters the economy through loans, stimulus, or asset purchases, the value of every dollar already in circulation slips just a little. It doesn't fall all at once. It erodes, slowly, predictably. And over the years, that erosion becomes a transfer, one that moves wealth away from people who hold cash toward people who hold assets. For families trying to save, that can feel like running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. The harder they work, the more the finish line moves. Meanwhile, those who own stocks, real estate, or businesses often watch their wealth grow simply because the system pushes asset prices upward. It's not always merit, it's mechanics. That's why we call inflation the invisible tax. You don't vote on it. You don't get a bill in the mail, but you pay it. Every time you fill a grocery cart, apply for a mortgage, or save for retirement. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. This is the hidden rhythm of the American economy. A system where the value of money steadily declines, where debt fuels growth, and where the Federal Reserve sits at the center, pulling levers that ripple through every household and every generation. Some call it stability, others call it control. But regardless of the label, the impact is real. And that impact leads to a question a lot of Americans are whispering today, even if they rarely say it out loud. Are we approaching the end of the Federal Reserve era as we know it? Around the world, new forces are rising. Nations are experimenting with currency alliances. Digital money is challenging the old definitions of value. Crypto has created communities who believe money should be beyond the reach of governments altogether. And the BRICS bloc is exploring alternatives to the dollar that would have sounded unthinkable 20 years ago. Does that mean the dollar is dying? Not necessarily, but it does mean the world is shifting. And whenever the world shifts, those who understand history have an advantage over those who ignore it. Because history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. The patterns return, the cycles return. The same pressures that shaped 1907, 1913, 1929, and 2008 are still with us today. Debt, confidence, fear, liquidity, leverage, and the quiet power of institutions most people never think about. The question isn't whether the system will change. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it does. And that's what Econ Atlas is here for. To decode the forces shaping your financial future, to translate the complexity into clarity, and to give you the context that headlines never will. So if you want to protect your wealth over the next decade, if you want to understand the rules of the game before the next chapter begins, and if you want to see what happens when money dies and what rises to replace it, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because the next episode in this series goes deeper, and once you understand what's coming, the decisions you make today may just change the next 10 years of your life.